Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, December 16th, 2025, and our dear friend John Helmer is here with us. Welcome back, John.
Thank you for having me, Nima. Good to be back.
Please hit the like button, helping us reaching more people. And John, let me start with what has happened in Australia at the Bondi Beach and the shooting. Right now, we know it was a father and his son shooting at
Mhm.
the Jewish community at the beach. And how did you find the whole case of this sort of shooting and the reactions from, for example, from Russia and other important countries? And what's going on in Australia right after this shooting? They were talking, you see in Australia, you see in Israel, they're talking about Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran being behind
Mhm.
these sort of attacks. What is your understanding of that?
Well, thanks for raising the question. It's not been properly discussed in the mass media, and therefore, and it's not even been discussed in the podcasting. So let's try to spend some time patiently going through first the evidence, then the law in Australia on terrorism, and then look at the scale and the motivations, because all we have here, and we'll go through it carefully and slowly and calmly, is the evidence of mass murder, terrible crimes for which one of the perpetrators is already dead and his son is in hospital and is coming out of a coma. So what we have here is not simply an Australian event. We had something similar in the United States, January 2025, when a Black American drove his pickup truck and killed on the Bourbon Street in New Orleans 15 people and sent more than 40 to hospital. We've had incidents like this. What we have to understand is, after the incident, what's the evidence, what's the law, and who controls the narrative for what kind of political gain? Gain by Israel against Iran, against Hamas, against the Arabs, against the Muslim, and so on. So let's just take it slowly and carefully. What's the evidence here? The evidence is that there are two men, one father, approximately 50 years old. I'm relying entirely on what the police and officials say. The son, Navid Akram, is alive. He's about 24. We know now 16 people have been killed and about 22 are in hospital, one or two in serious condition. We know from the Australian Intelligence Organization that they had monitored the son in 2019 and determined that he had interests in ISIS type doctrines, but they didn't consider him a risk of violence. We know that the man, senior Father Akram, Sajid, I believe his name is. Forgive me if I get some of these details wrong. We know from the Philippines immigration and from the Australian Border Control that from a trip they took last month, that Sajid Akram is an Indian national carrying an Indian passport, living in Australia on a partner visa. His wife, according to the Italian press, is Italian. The son was born in Australia and is carrying an Australian passport. The father and son went to the Philippines, spent about a month there in the southern island of Mindanao. They may have taken rifles. The son goes hunting or went hunting for some reason or other. The mother claims not to know that he was a good shot. He used to go hunting. Now, what we also know is what we don't know, what the government is not saying. On Monday, the police, the Prime Minister of Australia, the Premier Minns of New South Wales, the police commissioner, a man called Lanyon, and the ambulance commissioner gave a press conference on Monday. And it's very important to understand that when Lanyon was asked what happened, he announced, and I'm looking down at my notes to get the words right. He said, "I have determined that it was a terrorist activity and made a declaration as such at 9:36 p.m. Now, once he says that, he's referring to a law. Let's look at the law in Australia, what terrorism means. The law in New South Wales, it's called the Terrorism Police Powers Act of 2002. It copies what's the federal law. And I'll just read you what a terrorist act means. It means action done with the intention of advancing a political, religious, or ideological cause, and an action done with the intention of coercing or influencing by intimidation the government of the Commonwealth or a state, territory, or foreign country, or part of a state, territory, or foreign country, or intimidating the public or a section of the public. Now, that's what terrorism means legally. Were these two individuals committing terrorism? The police commissioner says it. But then when he's asked, and I'll read you what he said. First of all, he says there are only two offenders, no one else. They acted apparently alone. And they had a legal right to carry all these hunting rifles and guns, 6 of them. Lanyon, the police commissioner, was asked by a journalist, there are reports that a black ISIS flag was draped over the gunman's car. Are police aware of that? Has a flag been recovered? Lanyon said, that's all part of the investigation. As I said before, I'd rather not comment on that right now. We will look at the motives behind the attack. I think it's really important as part of the investigation. Now, there are, and I can show you, pictures of taken off a video of the car in which they apparently arrived at the Bondi beach site, in which there is a black ISIS-type flag draped across the windshield. It's not clear that that's a confirmed flag on the car. In other words, the police don't confirm that's an evidence. It could, in fact, be an image added to the video that's become viral. Why? Because it's essential in the post-incident to do what the police commissioner refused to do, to establish that this is a terrorist act. And we'll come on to how that's been elaborated. There's a video of the young man is a 17-year-old, allegedly, and I'm quoting from the press, looking down at the press because I've watched the video, preaching radical Islam. When you listen to what he says, he's saying nothing exceptional except God is one and Muhammad's his prophet, and I urge you all to go out and preach this doctrine. There's nothing radical about that. He says it in English. Everybody who can read or hear, understand English, understands this 17-year-old boy was simply repeating what he'd heard in church, so to speak. The commissioner was asked, did these two individuals, the shooters, leave any manifesto or notes? Again, Commissioner, again, that's part of the investigation. I don't want to go into it this morning. In other words, the police are not saying there's any ideology there. They're not saying that these people are, and I'm shuffling papers as I talk, are a member of any organization, state organization, or terrorist organization as they've been described. So what's next is, from the border control, we know that Sajid Akram went as an Indian national, that's what the Manila authorities said, with his son, and they spent almost a month in Philippines. We don't know what they did. The Australians say, and this is projection, because Mindanao has a Muslim population and has had significant Muslim terrorism organizationally there. I don't know enough about the Filipino situation to elaborate for anybody. This is a guilt by association. There's no information about what they did there. Okay? Now, when you look at what the Australians have said, you have to understand a couple of things that bring our audience back to the Ukraine war, the Russia war, and several things the Australians will not have done. I've written about in Dances with Bears, and for those who doubt what I have to say or want to know more, we'll go to it. There is a law in Australia called AVTOP. It's literally means Australian Victim of Terrorism Overseas Payment. Australia defines terrorism just as we read it out, but if Australians suffer from a terrorism abroad, they qualify for $75,000 compensation payment from the Australian government. Now, here's what's happened. There are approximately 50 terrorism incidents since this law came into effect, designated. But guess what isn't one of them? The shooting down of MH17 killed 38 Australians, 298 people on board. The Australian government refused to define that act as terrorism, though they were asked by the families associated with the victims. They were asked to do it, but they refused. Why? The papers are secret. I reported it at the time. The Prime Minister was unwilling to reveal at the time what the Attorney General said. Why? Because if terror or killing occurs inside a civil war situation or as part of a war, it's not terrorism. I'm not saying it's not a horrendous crime. I'm not minimizing the death. I'm simply saying that as Australia understands terrorism, the shooting down of MH17 was part of a civil war or a war in which Russia was engaged with the Ukraine and the Ukraine supporters, the United States, Great Britain, and France, and NATO, as we know. If that wasn't terrorism, who decides? Well, it's a political decision, you see. The Prime Minister decides by his discretion. It doesn't go to Parliament. There's no public debate. What's a terrorism act? Now, the Australian government decided that the October 2023 act, when Hamas broke out of Gaza and attacked the territory of Israel, that is classified as terrorism, not as Palestinian self-defense. It's not part of a war between the Arabs and Israel. It's not part of the war between Palestine and Israel. Nor has anyone in Australia suggested that the Israeli attack on Gaza, the genocidal attack on Gaza, as the International Court of Justice has defined, which is a terrorist act. It's an act of war. If Australians, and nobody's ever investigated it so far as I know, if Australian nationals or dual Palestinian Australians are hurt in or killed in Gaza as a result of Israeli action, it's not classified as anything but war. Okay? Now, all this may seem too legal to our audience. Why am I saying it? Because this particular act is being cast by the Israeli government, by Netanyahu, by Israeli ministers, in a way as to suggest that Hamas or Hezbollah or the Palestinian cause or anyone criticizing Israel for the genocide is in some sense responsible for what happened. What we know is that these two individuals, who may or may not have flown a black flag, as did Jabbar in New Orleans, have no record of saying anything to anyone about their motivation. They haven't claimed in any note why they did what they did. They haven't issued a manifesto, and so far as I know, no organization has claimed credit. It is quite different from all these other actions. What it is also different from is that there's no doubt they tried to shoot Jews. Okay? That this is very clear. It's clear when you watch the shooter. He shooed people away and concentrated on killing the people on the beach, the Chabad Lubavitcher group. That's what he did. In that sense, it's anti-Semitic. But let's just consider how Donald Trump discussed this, and then we'll look at how Maria Zakharova handled this to see if they use the word terror and how they meant it. We'll come back to what Netanyahu and other ministers have said, because that's important too. I'm now reading what Trump said. It was on Sunday at a Christmas reception at the White House. Before we begin, I just want to pay my respects to the people. Unfortunately, 2 are no longer with us. Brown University, 9 injured. And our two are looking down on us right now from heaven. And likewise in Australia, as you know, there was a terrible attack. 11 dead, 29 badly wounded. And that was an anti-Semitic attack, obviously. And I just want to pay my respects to everybody. I must say, in Syria also, we had an attack in Syria, and we had 3 great patriots terminated by bad people, and not the Syrian government. It was ISIS. Syrian government fought by our side. The new president fought by our side. That's what Trump said. Here's what Maria Zakharova said, 2029 on the 15th, next day, after Trump had spoken, around the time there was the Australian press conference. This is what Maria Zakharova said. It's the only Russian government statement I'm aware of. It was with deep sorrow that the news of the terrorist attack in Sydney during the celebration of Hanukkah in the Bondi beach area was perceived. We strongly condemn the barbaric extremist attack, which resulted in 15 innocent civilians, including a 10-year-old girl, were killed. Dozens were injured. As it became known, among the victims of the terrorist attack, unfortunately, there are our compatriots who are presently residing in Australia. We are invariably in favor of the uncompromising fight against terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. We call for the joint efforts of all countries in the world to jointly rebuff this barbarism. Now, what's going on here? Trump doesn't call this terrorism. He calls it murder, death. We all abhor that. There's nothing in anything I'm saying that minimizes the grief, the suffering, the death. There's terrible crime committed here, mass murder. But Trump doesn't call it terrorism. He says nothing about Israel. He says it was anti-Semitic because there's no doubt the targets were Jews and they were selected because they were Jewish. But he doesn't identify anyone as a terrorist. Why does Zakharova identify the shooters as terrorists? Why does she refer to our compatriots? Why does she make it appear that terrorism in Bondi Beach is the same as terrorism at the Crocus City Hall, when several hundred people were killed? Now, if the Russian statement is to be understood, she is completely obscuring the difference between a state behind terrorist attack, the state of Ukraine, and behind them the Tajiks involved, who were ISIS-K, but they were paid by Ukraine, and behind Ukraine were plotters, the allies of the Ukrainians, the US, the British Secret Service, and so on. All of this has been made public by the Russian side. How come Mrs. Zakharova has forgotten the difference between state-directed terrorism? India's just had 2 episodes, Pahalgam 26 people killed in Kashmir, followed by the Red Fort attack. I think 16 people killed very recently. State-directed terrorism. The Indians suffered. The Indians have identified it as Pakistan-directed terror. Excuse me, has Russia lost, or has Mrs. Zaharova lost, the capability to detect the difference? Now, what happened in Australia is now is not regarded by Trump as terrorism. It's not. First. Second, that doesn't mitigate, it doesn't mean Trump's unsympathetic. It's simply, why have some people adopted this terrorist tag? That then brings us to the question of who the compatriots are. This is extraordinary. The Chabad Lubavitcher movement was holding a celebration for Hanukkah. They don't deserve the fate. However, Chabad Lubavitcher is a movement that's been anti-Russian for its entire history. It's been messianic, proselytizing to drive against the Soviet government when Rabbi Schneerson was alive and active from New York. Schneerson was born in Nikolaev in the Ukraine. This group runs an organization called FREE, Friends of Refugees from Eastern Europe. It's anti-Russian. To speak, yes, they speak Russian, but they are arguably, as Australia is arguably, what Russia calls unfriendly. Okay? Now, why are they termed compatriots? Are the white generals of World War I, Wrangel, Yudenich, are they considered compatriots? Is Vlasov, the general who fought, the Russian who fought on the Nazi side, considered a compatriot? Of course not. So we have a problem with the Russian statement. It misreads the evidence to treat all forms of terrorism and violence the same when they're not. It misreads the targets as compatriots when they're not. Why? And the Russian side didn't issue any condolence when the American attack in New Orleans happened. That also flew, if you like, a black ISIS flag. There's no doubt that that flag was flying on the vehicle that caused the killing in New Orleans. Did that make that individual a state entity? Of course it didn't. A deranged, murderous individual? Yes. Well, what do we make of these two? Well, let's try to put this in a bigger scale, the scale of the genocide in Gaza, the scale of Australia's contribution to all the wars fought against Afghanistan. Australia joined the United States there. Australia joined the war against Iraq. Australia joined in the war against Syria. Australia joined against and supports Israel in the genocide. Approximately 2%. I've done these numbers just to give you a sense of the scale. Australia's paying roughly 2% of its GDP, and at an average Australian wage of $100,000 a year, that's quite a lot. Each Australian is paying $410, I count, to kill Russians in the Ukraine. Australia is a designated unfriendly country doing that, and to kill Arabs in the Middle East. It's taken the US side. Okay. Now, it's done that without a parliamentary vote. Why am I mentioning it? Because there's a very big conflict coming in Australia. There is in Australia approximately 1 million Muslim people, and they're rapidly increasing. About 37% of them, I'm looking down at the census numbers, are second generation. They've come from somewhere else. Their parents came from somewhere else, and they're very young. The next comes Pakistan, Afghanistan, Lebanon. Think about these countries. These are countries in which war has been caused. They are fleeing war, and they come to Australia. Afghanistan, Lebanon, Bangladesh, Iraq, Turkey, Iran, India, and Indonesia. These are the major countries for the Muslim population of Australia. There are 1 million of them. How many Jewish people? There are 110,000. And they're declining in numbers, and they're declining in religiosity, their religious commitment. So what do we have? We have a country that pays without parliamentary vote to go to war in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Palestine, supports the destruction of these countries, as we've seen and talked about. And 1 million people oppose this. They oppose it. And many of them, most of them, a majority of them are young, and they go out in the street. And most of the people who've been in Sydney and Melbourne demonstrations, and they're very large, include Muslim people, Arab people from the countries I just mentioned, but they're completely disenfranchised. The 110,000 Jewish people who are big, concentrated in Melbourne and Sydney, are now saying, and this is where controlling the narrative becomes the message here for us to understand. The Jewish communities of Melbourne and Sydney, the Israeli leadership are saying any form of criticism of Israel, any form of criticism of the genocide, any form of criticism of going to war against Iran, all of that is now considered anti-Semitism. Well, this is different from what these two shooters did. They tried to kill Jews. We don't know what they said. We don't know what they think. Why? They're not very well educated. They didn't go to university. They don't produce social media themselves. They didn't leave notes. They're not speaking for themselves. They're symbols. And our problem as analysts, the problem of everyone listening to us, is to understand what are they symbols of. Now, Trump did not say they're symbols of Israeli defense, but Netanyahu did. Netanyahu and the others have criticized the Australian government for recognizing Palestine as a state. They've said Australia's policies are so weak. Arguably they are. I'm not going to defend Australia, but the Israeli position is if you, quotes, and their words, appease the Palestinians, you go on the road to this. All Jews will suffer. And there are many even more, let's say, dramatic claims. So what do we have? What we have in Australia is a boiling pot in which Muslim population, disenfranchised, find the countries of their origins, which forced their parents to flee from war. Those countries in war are now targeted by people they consider to be the United States, Israel, and their allies. And they don't want Australia to join that alliance. So they go out in the street, and there they're now described as anti-Semitic. And anyone who joins the criticism of the International Court of Justice, if they're in the universities, if they're professors, if they're students, anti-Semitism is being declared a hate crime. Well, what these men did was a hate crime. They killed Jews because they're Jews. But what the Russian statement says is different. It's terrorism. Well, it's not like the Crocus City Hall terrorism. It's not like the terrorism that might be better described as war. I don't understand why Mrs. Zakharova confuses terrorism with war. There's no doubt that Russia has been the victim of both. But in Australia, what's happening is different. It's very similar in France, in Germany, in England, in the United States, that rising numbers of Muslim voters object to genocide of their fellow religious communities or their fellow nationals, if they're Arabs. They object. And democratically, they have the right to object, to assemble, to protest. There is no, therefore, for our audience, is there a relationship? Is there a link, as the Israelis suggest, but Trump did not, between what happened on Bondi Beach and what's happening in the Middle East? That's for the audience to say. I say what happened in Bondi Beach was a terrible mass murder. But was it terrorism? On the evidence? Not apparently to Trump. On the law in Australia? Apparently none. The police commissioner couldn't find and say no evidence according to the law. Is there to be a problem then? How to solve the problem? The problem is how to express criticism when terrible things like this happen. Then our job, how to control the narrative. What's true? What's false? Sorry, that's a bit long-winded, isn't it?
Yeah. Thank you, John, for your comprehensive, explanation. And many of us were taught yesterday. We were talking about it, but didn't have that much of detail, as you mentioned in your description. And John, let me shift the gear a little bit to the conflict in Ukraine and the latest article in the Telegraph. They're reporting that the United States has issued Zelensky an ultimatum, accept, they're asking accept Washington's, security guarantees or lose them. And it seems that the United States is trying to provide guarantees to Ukraine as they have it in NATO's Article 5.
Yes.
And I don't know if that would be acceptable for Russia. I don't see that happening. What is your understanding, and what can the United States give to Ukraine that would be acceptable for Russians?
Well, pardon me. The Russian position is that if a comprehensive agreement can be reached that includes the consolidation of territory, a demilitarized zone so deep as not to threaten with terrorism or with war, long-range missiles, long-range drones, what have you, a demilitarized zone in which it's not possible for NATO or NATO allied units to operate armaments against Russia. That's what the demilitarized zone is for, a change of regime by election, a reduction of the capacity of the Ukrainian army, not 800,000, which is the last number, even higher than the present existing Ukrainian army. All of these provisions are part of the Russian security package. Yes, we've been told that the 28, then 27 terms have been cut into 4 packages: security guarantees, territory, US-Russia relations, and so forth. We've been told that, and we've been told that Vitkov and Kushner brought that to Putin. Putin and Lavrov have said this is consistent with the Alaska arrangements. But when Trump was most recently asked, December 15, that's yesterday, Monday, he was asked, what about Article 5 type security guarantees without NATO membership? The NATO membership's a red herring. NATO occupies Ukraine, uses it as a war platform now. It's a red herring. There's Article 5 in practical effect. So Trump said, no security guarantee can be given to the territory which has been lost. That's a major concession, is it not? He said they've already lost the territory, to be honest. In terms of security guarantee, we're working on it. Europe would be a big part of that. We're working with Europe. We don't want to have the war start up again. I think, and I'm reading Trump as of yesterday, I think we've made a lot of progress with respect to Russia and Ukraine. And then he drops the time concession. Remember, we were supposed to come to terms before Christmas. Okay, he's dropped that. There's no time limit. The time limit is whenever we get it done. We're making progress. Then the reporter says, have you spoken directly to Putin? Yeah, I have. He hasn't. He's referring to the past. Now, I hope that answers your question. On the one hand, what he's saying there is and we'll repeat it, he cannot afford a US defeat in the Ukraine. To the extent that he's brought General Grinkovich, who's the Supreme Allied Commander, who was at the table that we can see when Vitkov was there, to the extent that you have a senior American military man at the table now, what the other side, which is really now led by Merz, Chancellor, the little Chancellor of Germany, the 28% popular support of the little Chancellor. He's running the opposition now, the war against Russia. The general's saying, you're going to lose more. And our side is prepared to give security guarantees to what's left. What's left. If you don't settle soon, you'll have less left. That's what they're saying. And so it seems to me that Trump is increasingly clear that he faces a defeat unless he can get the Ukrainians to sign off onto something that looks a non-defeat for him. But let's not kid ourselves that there's such a wonderful change in US policy. General Donahue, who heads US Army Europe and Middle East, says, and he said it only the other day, the US military, quotes, will always lead in Europe, in particular the army. Nobody can replace Roman legions. If you want to win, you have to put people on the ground. That will not change. Okay? So if I put Trump together with Donahue, with Grinkovich at the table, what do I see here? The US doesn't want to be defeated and run away from the Ukraine. It wants to save a platform there so that they can go on preserving their legions, as Donahue called them, in Germany, in Poland, in Finland, all the way up to Greenland. That's what they want. In addition, as we've said before, they want to sequence their big capacities eastwards to Asia against China. So, in my view, the good news for Russia is, first, no time limit. Well, the Russian side is advancing. It's accelerating its advance. We can see that on the ground. We can see it in the casualty rate. We can see all the evidence of that. If there's no deadline, Russia will keep moving westward. And President Putin has more than once said, if we don't achieve these security objectives by diplomacy, and we're open to doing that, we'll take it by force. And that's what's happening. So did I answer the question? I think it's positive only in the sense that Trump is covering his retreat with the only military means he's got. The political means require Zelensky and Merz to throw in the towel. Otherwise, they will be left naked. And Trump doesn't want that. General Donahue doesn't want Germany naked. They don't. Otherwise, that would be revolutionary change. And Russia's not keen on that, except it is keen on reducing war. And so when Trump says we need comprehensive peace, we don't want a pause, the Russian view, the general staff view that I've been trying to convey, that my sources convey, has been the Americans want a pause. We expect to go back to war in 3 or 4 years. We can live with that. We need the pause too. But if Trump's saying, we're not going to pause, we will give you the security guarantees, that means for Russia something very different from what Merz and Zelensky want right now.
John, putting, the U.S. national security strategy together with what Politico was mentioning about
Yes.
Core 5, C5, not considering Europe being part of the new sort of mindset in Washington. They're talking about, I don't know how realistic is that, but it's there. It was reported by Politico. That's why, in my opinion, is important. They're talking about Russia, China, India, Japan, these 5: China, Russia, India, Japan, and the fifth I just escaped me. But Europeans are not part of that. And when you look at the situation in Europe, how do you see the future, considering the national security strategy of the United States? How, because it's important for the future of Europe, for what they have in their mind when they come together, talk about the situation in Ukraine. They see beyond what's going on in Ukraine, and how they see the US behavior in a long term, and what do they want from the United States, what do they want from Russia, from China, and how do they see themselves without all these superpowers, relying on these superpowers and being some sort of powerhouse? Is that the case still in their mind, or they don't care anymore about that?
Well, I think that the answer would be different if you asked the question of a German or a Frenchman or a Swiss. Our colleague Jacques Beau is Swiss, and he's now facing European sanctions for answering your question. And maybe we come back to that later, because the one thing that's common is the increasing repression of critical views in France against military officers, retired generals, in Germany against journalists, against members of political parties that oppose Merz, and so on. I think each of the European countries has to be treated separately. There are different stories. There are different weaknesses. Starmer is weak in a different way in the UK from Macron, who's weak in France in a very different way. But Macron is capable of ruling by decree, something we've said before. Macron needs the perception of an external war threat, Russia, to justify much of his decree rule, while the real domestic politics of France are disintegrating. I mean, the agriculture, the farming, there are as many scandals as you can think of in which Macron has gone against the French people in different sectors in different ways. The one thing he retains is the executive power to make war, and to make war against whom? To tax for war against whom? There's only one target for such a weakling who rules in such a strong, let's say, non-parliamentary way. That's the French story. It isn't the British story. In the British story, how can we explain over the last week, as you know, as our English audience understands, there's been the completion of all these years since 2018 of the Novichok story, with a British government report that blames President Putin for personally authorizing or having moral responsibility for launching a chemical warfare attack on Britain in March 2018. Now, almost everybody in England either believes that or stays silent when the official version is published, and all the media think that. England, the British, the UK, is totally brainwashed, you might say, on the notion that Russia's the enemy. And so we have a different story of how Prime Minister Starmer mobilizes against that enemy. And I think that the German situation's different, the Dutch situation's different. How do they come together? Well, two ways. Trump threatens each of them with tariff punishment unless they come together. They need to feel they can feed Trump's, war policy, which is we will buy arms from you, in order to buy tariff protection. You can do the arithmetic. I'm sure they do it each country. A tariff protection, relief of Trump's tariff threats are paid for in terms of purchasing weapons for use in the Ukraine. So from each European country has its own particular problem, and the European Union has a general problem of negotiating with Trump's extortion, trade weapon. It therefore feeds the NATO 5% increase. And we've been through what the NATO 5% increase means for each of these countries. It's essentially a protection racket. We pay you more, you allow us to trade more. We subtract what we pay you from what we earn from you, and with a bit of luck, we're ahead. Only the European publics aren't ahead. So how to convince them to keep voting? You can't. So what we have is repression, extortion, deception, repression. This is how it is for the Europeans. Meanwhile, I would say that the perception that Merz, Starmer, and Macron are meeting and holding hands with Zelensky to resist unreasonable concessions to the Russians on Trump's part is a circus, is a fantasy, which Russia will solve on the battlefield. Do you disagree with that? I mean,
John, Germany is dealing with a lot of difficulties when it comes to their economy, and we know that Volkswagen yesterday the Volkswagen is just closing one of its plants after 88 years. It's important what's going on in Germany. At the same time, you see Germans are talking about rebuilding or making their military stronger in order to deal with Russia by 2029. What is about 2029? What is the key when they're talking about 2029? Is that some sort of cooperation, some sort of, I don't know, making a new sort of coalition in Europe against Russia? Or they feel that by 2029 we're still having this sort of this war in Ukraine?
Well, I don't know the significance of 2029 in the budget planning of any of these countries, Poland, Germany, France, Great Britain. I don't see the significance of 2029 as such. The 5% has to be phased in over time. So, but 3 years is rather short, if I'm not mistaken. We know that all of the Europeans are running out of cash. They can't tax their populations anymore to finance the war. So they want to steal the Russian assets and turn the sovereign assets, the $300 billion, give or take a few, into collateral or direct lending to the Ukraine to fund what Europe can't afford. Now, that's an admission that the European populations won't be taxed more to continue a losing war. Will they agree to continue the war against Russia by remilitarizing the German economy, the British economy, and so on? Each country is going to be different. And I can't predict how that would be. A big, massive defeat in Ukraine may have a shock effect on public opinion. It may, as it were, reverse all the gains of propaganda. It doesn't seem likely that there will be such a big shock. But if we were just thinking about this and thinking about our own audience for podcasts, podcast audiences go for shock, right? We're winning or we're losing. Blood's on the ground. It's exciting. Zelensky's out. Budanov has disappeared. This sort of excitement can reverse the perception of who wins, who loses. Is that not so? So if Trump is calculating, along with his Pentagon generals, along with his army secretary, Vice President Vance and the others, that there should be no shock, no Kabul retreat, no Saigon evacuation. A shock would, in fact, they would worry, both demonstrable loss of confidence in Trump at home for the midterms and demonstrable loss of confidence in each of these governments, some closer to election than others. So avoiding the shock and padding out the spending to make employment growth seem more feasible, these would seem to me to be the targets. I think we've said it before. I don't understand, pardon me, quite why or when the mass media of each of these countries will face the potential shock of defeat. How long can the fantasy of Zelensky's winning or can win, combined with the fantasy that Russia's economy is weak, et cetera, how long can the mass media sustain public opinion on that? I don't know. It seems to me public opinion in England, in the UK, in France, in Germany is deeply anti-government now. Deeply anti-government. And there's no consensus for war against Russia to add to their domestic troubles. So,
John, what is, in my opinion, important, but about 2029, we know that by 2029, Donald Trump is gone. He's not going to be anymore in power in the United States.
True.
That may bring someone like Joe Biden to power.
Well, you don't mean Joe Biden. You mean somebody healthier.
Yeah, I want someone like Joe Biden. Yeah.
You mean a Democrat?
A Democrat or someone who is totally in line, or who totally supports the concept that has created this conflict, this war in Ukraine.
Well, that's an explanation for why 2029 is minus Trump means minus something that Russia would accept. But that's based on a Russian notion that Trump is a better bet than his successor. I don't buy that. I think it's much too early to figure that the Democrats could come up with a candidate that would prosecute a losing war like this in a way that's more negative for Russia, for example. On the other, the Russian confidence is factionalized in Moscow. We've talked about this before. The belief is that Trump's corruption, Trump's connection to business through whether it's through his family, the two sons, his son-in-law Kushner, whether it's through Witkoff, whether it's through Lutnick, whether through Bessent, whether through Elon Musk, whether through the network of Republican donors, the business connections seem to Russian oligarchs and businessmen as bribable, as potentially as corrupt as they themselves know how to operate. Therefore, they think that the Trump combination offers better hope, better opportunity for resuming business as usual, which is one of the 4 packages in the settlement agreement. It's one of the reasons you find a faction in Russia willing to listen to the possibility of privatization of sovereign reserves and turning it into a common investment fund. That's not a consensus under Putin. It's not Putin's consensus either, but it is a view in Russia. After 28, and let's bear in mind, Trump himself has not exactly disclaimed the possibility of running again. Equally, he may not be well enough to reach the end of 2028. I don't find the prospect of the absence of Trump particularly progressive, either in terms of reaching security accommodations in Europe, reassuring the Europeans that Russia isn't going to invade their countries. I don't find it reassuring at all. I don't find Trump regime or his national security strategy as reassuring as many people think that strategy is. I think it's a dressing up of retreat from losing positions to concentrate on winning positions. And it still represents massive extortion around the world. It threatens India, it threatens China, it threatens Russia most. But the rest of the countries are all threatened. As for the peace, we can see the so-called peace agreements coming apart each day, each hour, whether in the Middle East, in Central Africa, or on the Thai-Cambodian border. These are nonsense ceasefires. No, I don't see Trump as much of an opportunity. I don't see 29 as a predictable opportunity at all. But who thinks it's an opportunity, do you think?
Actually, I literally, we don't know. We know that in the United States, at least, they're able to somehow. No, there is a difference, in my opinion, between Donald Trump and Biden, and his administration. But
Yes.
after all, looking at the national security strategy of the United States, I think it's all the same. You see, the zero-sum game. You have
I
to.
agree with
Yeah, after
Yes.
I totally agree. The big picture is still the same. Doesn't changes that much. Yeah.
Yes, the forces are moved from one place to another. But a shock defeat, a collapse, a Kabul-type collapse in Kiev would be, if we try to imagine what that would be like, a Kabul collapse in Kiev would have a massive shock effect. Do we agree about that? I think our audience would agree. We'd all agree. And Trump would be subject to domestic criticism that he lost the war, something he keeps repeating. It's not his war. So he can't win it. He can't lose it. The shock effect, however, what would that do? As you mentioned, the closures of major German industries and their expatriation to cheaper zones where Russian gas is more available, Russian energy is more available. All of those things benefit China, they benefit India, and increasing amounts of investment from Europe will go to India and China, not to Russia, but to India and China. And that doesn't do German voters, French voters, Italian voters, English voters any good at all. But a shock must be about the biggest nightmare these politicians can have. They wake up and they've lost their war. And Trump's the first person to say, you lost your war. It was not my war. He's trying to avoid that for them all.
Yeah, in the United States, they're trying to blame this war, the defeat in Ukraine, on each other. And you see Donald Trump in his recent interview, he was talking about, the key was the Crimea, the case of Crimea. Obama lost Crimea because he's trying to diminish what's going on. It's
Yes.
Here is what the domestic policy means. Why Putin says that domestic policy, the domestic situation in the United States is hitting the foreign policy of the United States. Everybody depends on this sort of fight between Democrats, Republicans.
Yes.
After all, yeah, it's unbelievable what's going on now. Thank you so much, John, for being with us today. Great pleasure.
Thank you for having me, Nima.
As always.
A week's a long week in politics, so let's see what happens next week. Let's see what happens next week.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.